for joining today's webinar, California's Cradle-to-Career Data System, the power of data to inform policy. We'll get started in just a moment. Today's webinar, California's Cradle-to-Career Data System, the power of data to inform policy. My name is Shannon Serrato, Communications Director at TICAS. Before heading over to our moderator, I wanted to highlight a few things. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will provide the recording to attendees after the event. It will also be posted on our event page, and the link is being dropped in the chat. We're using a closed captioning service to ensure today's discussion is accessible for all attendees. If tech assistance is needed at any point during this webinar, please contact TICAS Senior Comms Associate Anjali Palomar. She will drop her info in the chat now. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our event moderator, TICAS Associate Director, Angela Perry. Please take it away, Angela.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you all for joining us for this morning's webinar, California's Cradle-to-Career Data System, the power of data to inform policy. I just wanted to say that I loved our intro music and it got me very jazzed to talk about data this morning. As Shannon said, my name is Angela Perry. I'm an associate director here at TICAS. TICAS is a research and advocacy organization focused on student-centered research and student-centered public policies, that promote affordability, accountability, and equity in higher education. For 15 years, TICAS has worked to close economic and racial gaps in college opportunity, both at the federal level and in California. That is why we were so excited in 2019 when the state legislature passed the California Cradle-to-Career Data System Act, which set in motion the creation of a statewide longitudinal data system containing educational, workforce, financial aid, and social service information designed to address disparities and improve outcomes for all students. The Cradle-to-Career Data System will be a neutral source of high-quality information, and the proposal includes plans to create tools to help a range of stakeholders to utilize the information. TICAS has been proud to be part of the planning process for the Cradle-to-Career Data System, and we believe the data system will help chart a path to educational success, especially in the years following the pandemic and economic recession. California is actually one of the last states to create such a longitudinal data system. We are fortunate enough to be able to learn from our colleagues in other states and develop our data system based on the learned experience of those who went before us. Today, we're going to hear from several speakers who can share about the history and vision for the Cradle-to-Career Data System, as well as several experts from other states who can share insights about the ways their data systems have been helpful to both students and policymakers. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and I'm so grateful to all of our speakers for joining us today. Following the speakers' presentations, we're going to hold a Q&A session, so please take note of any questions you have, and you can enter them in the chat. We'll circle back to them later in the presentation. Without any further ado, let me turn things over to our first speaker, Leanne Fong-Batkin, the Senior Policy Manager with WestEd, to talk to us a little bit about the Cradle-to-Career Data System. Leanne?
Thank you. May I get the first slide up? Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're here today. This has been an amazing process, and we are just so thankful to our other states and all of our participants in the planning process for a wonderful experience. So thank you for having me. So as you know, California has many separate and disconnected information on various education systems, social services programs, and employment. So even within just the K-12 sphere, you've got CalPADS, you've got the community colleges, the CSU, the UC, and all kinds of databases and dashboards all over the place, but it's not connected. It's been challenging, really, so we can't identify barriers or successes, as our students move through their career trajectories and go from all the way from early ed through K-12 to post-secondary to the workforce. And so what we're trying to do is create actionable information that can be put in the hands of our communities to make change. Next slide, please. So as Angela mentioned, in 2019, California legislature and the governor's office approved the Cradle-to-Career Data System Act, and it called for the creation of a statewide longitudinal data system. This is going to be the first for California. And for those of you that have been around in the policy world for a while, we lost the California Post-Secondary Education Commission back in 2010 or 2011. And so there's really been not a great tool since. So now we are almost at the end of our 18-month planning process. With WestEd, we are the neutral facilitator for the planning process, and we work closely with the governor's office and our 16 partner entities. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just show you the breadth and depth of the different entities that we're working with. The legislation called out specifically that we work with early learning and K-12. We also have post-secondary. We also have some education-related entities. We have employment and workforce training, social services and health, and then our data experts. And so between all of these groups, we've been meeting since January 2020, but then we also have our education advocacy community and all of our community-based organizations. So, you know, we've been working with over 200 people to make this process happen. And it's just, I'm just amazed at what the committees have been able to accomplish. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a very high level overview of the planning timeline. The blue boxes and that teal box in the middle represent the actions that we took in 2020. And then the orange one at the end is just 2021 because we've only got maybe just over a month left. Wanted to point out that we have done a couple of legislative reports. And if you're interested, then I believe the staff is going to post that link in there. So we had our initial report that went out in December 2020. We did a progress report on April 1st, and our last legislative report will be on June 30th. The first legislative report that was issued in December has the meat of what the recommendations are. So if you're interested, please check that out. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to share with you the vision and mission. I've described that this is going to have data from early care to K-12 to higher ed, the workforce and employment. And we really just want to make the data actionable. You know, it's one thing to have a data system up there. It's another thing to know what to do with it. And I know our other speakers are going to cover that. Next slide, please. So there's going to be three tools. We think of it as a three-legged stool. So we first have the analytical tools. So for the data geek researchers like me, I'm waiting for this. I just can't wait to dig my hands in. It'll be a series of dashboards, a query builder, some fact sheets, a research library of information and studies that have been done based on Cradle-to-Career data. We will also have the second set, which is operational tools. And so these are the tools for our students and our families. So college and career planning is hard. Our high schools and middle schools and all schools have been really impacted by the pandemic. And we know that counselors are just overworked. And so these tools will help everybody and practitioners do what they need to do. So you can take a look to see if your student has completed A to G eligibility requirements. You can link to information on financial aid and applying for college and all kinds of good stuff. Eventually, we will also add on a service through eTranscript California, and that will have electronic transcripts. So that's a new thing too. The third tool is support tools, and these are the professional development and technical assistance things necessary to make sure that the data system works. You know, we need to make sure that you know what to do with information in the data system. We know that our communities need help with translating some of the data and presenting it to their constituents. So that's the support tools. Next slide, please. So the timeline for implementation, we're listed in the governor's budget in January 21, and it includes funding for the 21-22 fiscal year. And we will see what happens in the May revise and the governor's budget. But because that we've done so much of the planning, we are poised for immediate action. So if the governor's budget includes our funding, we're ready to go as of July 1st. It takes about a year to get everything up and running, get all the data in, get it massaged, get all of the dashboards built and all of that good stuff. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's it for now. Please let us know if you have any questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That was incredibly helpful to look at the history and the vision for the California data system. Our next speaker is actually working towards a similar goal with AB 99, arguably the same goal with AB 99. And I'm now going to turn things over to Assemblymember Jackie Irwin of California's 44th Assembly District. Assemblymember Irwin, whenever you're ready.
Yes, yes. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you putting together this webinar, and I appreciate also the introduction from Angela and Leanne about the importance of data. You know, there's been a lot of stakeholders that have worked really hard to get us to this point. From my perspective as a legislator and an engineer by training, I know the power of data to cut through the noise and to create a common set of facts. And I think that that is absolutely crucial. And as I think it was Angela mentioned before, in California, policymakers, researchers, and members of the public have a very difficult time being able to answer key questions about a student's journey through various levels of education. And when we do have data, it's usually thanks to dedicated researchers who have spent time to gather and standardize it. It's really important to have this data to look at key transition points in a student's journey to really see what's working and what's not working. I just want to give a quick example about some work that we did in remedial education, AB 705. What we found was that the average student was spending 6 years in community college. And when you look deeper into the data, what you realize is that the biggest impediment was that students were being placed in remedial education when they were really quite capable of doing transfer level work. If you are placed, and we see this at our local community college, if you're placed in a remedial class a few levels below transfer, the students have a 25% chance of ever making it into a transfer level class or moving through. So with 705, we required the students to, if they were capable, to be placed in transfer level classes. And we're seeing the data come in, and it has made a tremendous difference in literally tens of thousands of students' journey through community college. And that's why it is so important to see what policies are working and see what policies aren't working through data. California is a large and diverse state, and it's impossible to hear from every stakeholder. They can't all show up at school board meetings or in the legislature. And so a data system will ensure that no student is left out or left behind, because we'll see it in the numbers. And the pandemic, we're all hearing about learning loss because of the pandemic. It's really important to see where it is that we need to put our resources to make sure that we can move students forward. And without a comprehensive data set, that becomes a much more difficult issue. A much more difficult problem to solve. So I think we're seeing a really exciting and important cultural shift in how we use data in California. For so long, it was thought that data and reporting requirements were a necessary evil, something that schools and agencies had to do to be compliant. But I think more and more leaders are realizing that data is not something to be afraid of. Data is something that we can use to solve problems. So again, thank you for all the work that the stakeholders have done. It's been a very comprehensive process, and we're really looking forward to see this longitudinal data effort implemented in California.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Irwin. It is so valuable to be reminded of the very real reasons that this data system is necessary, and also to be reminded that data is something to be celebrated, not to be feared. So I so appreciate that. That is so helpful. The next thing that we're going to do is get to hear a little bit about some of the experiences of other experts in other states. So we're going to turn now to hear from Meredith Fergus, Meredith Fergus, the Director of Research for the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. Meredith, I am so excited to hear from you.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks, everybody. I have to say it was really great to hear what Assemblymember Irwin had to say, because it does mirror a lot of what Minnesota legislators say as well for the purpose of our system. And so let me start out on the next slide by just telling you a little bit about our system. So our system internally is referred to as the P20W system. However, we have two brands that we operate under. SLEDS, the statewide longitudinal education data system, and ECLDS, the early childhood longitudinal education data system. Whoops, take the E out of that. There are approximately 6 state agencies that could supply data: Health, Human Services, Corrections, K-12 education, which would include some of those pre-K programs, as well as higher education and workforce. In Minnesota, all of our public and private colleges that participate in state financial aid do submit student level data to our office. And so our office does submit that data to our state longitudinal data system. We also include data from the Teacher Licensing Board. And as of last summer, we actually have data from Ramsey County, which is the home of St. Paul. And so within that, we have about 159 tables of data, and we do buy data from 4 vendors, the usual suspects, I'll say. And our data is retrospective. We are a centralized system. And so we load data every 6 months, June and November, and we're about a year lag in terms of when it's actually active. So this year's school level data will actually go into our system next spring. And on the next slide, you can kind of see, we cover anyone who is born in Minnesota. We do have birth certificate data, those receiving services and or funding related to health, basic needs, education, or work, those incarcerated, those working in or licensed to work, and other organizations involved in those services, health, basic needs, education. As of our last load, we had just over 29 million records. Keep in mind, Minnesota is a state with a population of 5 million persons. And so 29 million individual person records that once you deduplicate them come to about 9.2 million individuals who have entered our state, worked in our state, been educated in our state, or have somewhere touched the state of Minnesota. So it's a pretty cool process. We came on board in 2011 with the SLED system, and ECLDS came on board in 2015. So about 5 years later. Because we are branded as 2 separate systems, we have 2 governance boards, and those governance boards have outlined slightly different visions, but you'll see a lot of parallels here. SLEDS was created to identify the most viable pathways for individuals in achieving successful outcomes in education and work, whereas ECLDS is intended to facilitate Minnesota's ability to answer policy and research questions about outcomes for young children over their life course. Within those visions, responsiveness to stakeholders' needs, be it parents, students, teachers, principals, community members, as well as our legislature, is important, making sure that we're actually sustainable and responsive. On the next slide, you can kind of see what we are in legislation. So even though we started in 2011 officially, we were adopted into state legislation in 2014. The Minnesota P20 Education Partnership is our overarching governing body, and that's comprised of 45 different members, both legislative, association heads, as well as commissioners and community members to help kind of govern and guide the direction of both systems. And so within state law, we are to expand reporting on educational outcomes, evaluate the effectiveness of early care education and workforce, and to evaluate the relationships between early care education and workforce. So in terms of the research we've actually done, we do have 2 defined research agendas on the next slide. And those agendas are kind of, they came about in very different ways. So for the SLED system, we did a large stakeholder engagement process and asked everyone to submit questions on what they wanted our system to answer. And when the kind of working group sat down to analyze those policy questions, we realized everyone was asking the same question, just about a different group of students or a different group of individuals. And so we developed what we call the 4 Ps of research. Essentially, stakeholders want to know what the pathways are for individuals or how they move between our systems, their progress, what are the benchmarks or transition points individuals meet or fail to meet, what are the predictors, the characteristics, patterns, or commonalities to help explain success, and performance. How well are we aligned across all systems for individual success? On the early childhood side, they took a very similar process. And so their questions were about, what do we know about children participating in our programs? And what is the status after participating in our programs? So very much a programmatic evaluation and policy development focus. SLEDS has a very robust research agenda. And so we do, much like is in the California plan, we do allow access to the data to evaluate programs. It is not all state-driven reporting. We do have 3 reporting websites that are publicly available. And that is the sledsmn.gov website, which focuses essentially on kindergarten through workforce. The ECLDS website, which is focused on birth to grade 3. And then we actually have a graduate employment outcomes website, which is focused on college into the workforce. However, outside of those 3 public reporting websites, we actually have a number of data projects that went on behind the scenes that are actually published reports. And so my office actually leads, because it's as director of the system, it's my job to be responsive to legislative and stakeholders' needs. So we take on a lot of reports for which organizations that may not have research capacity to do it. We also take on all legislative requests for reports. So those come to our office. In terms of the kind of research that we've done, we do the basics. We provide all our high schools back with a feedback report on their college going and employment after high school. We also have a mandated developmental education course taking report. That was actually our first state mandated report. We have reports on career and technical education as well as adult basic education. We also use our SLEDS system to do the WIOA reporting for the eligible training provider list. So that is another kind of federal compliance report we do. Across the other kind of policy areas, we did use our SLDS to establish benchmarks for using our K-12 accountability tests as the benchmarks or assessments for developmental education placement in college. So if a student was deemed proficient on their K-12 accountability math test in 11th grade, they could not be placed into developmental education. And our colleges and our state education agency work together to develop those benchmarks. We've also evaluated a number of employment programs. So the city of Minneapolis passed a minimum wage, a $15 minimum wage. They are evaluating the impact on employment patterns differentiated by educational level, the result of that minimum wage being enacted. We've also studied racial gaps in probably every single system in the state of Minnesota for a variety of reasons of which you are very well aware. In addition, we've done some kind of ad hoc studies. Probably the most prominent is what are the college outcomes of students who are homeless while in K-12? And that report was probably the biggest kind of shocker for us, because even though a small percentage of kids are homeless, meaning they get the McKinney-Vento flag on their K-12 record, the rate at which they complete college is less than 10%. And so when you're talking about helping students bridge that housing insecurity need and actually make it into college and finish college and gain sustainable employment at a family sustaining wage, that report really highlighted the work that needed to be done for our families experiencing homelessness. And so this is just a kind of a brief kind of overview of the work we've kind of done and how it's informed policy and practice. I should say our legislative session is just wrapping up and we have 2 new mandated reports. The state of Minnesota for the first time is actually enacting a unified kindergarten readiness assessment. Prior to this year, districts got to choose their own assessment, and needless to say, they all chose different assessments. So reporting off different assessments became problematic. We also have a mandated report to report on the post-secondary and employment outcomes of individuals who are in foster care while they were youth. And so that's another report we'll be working on this summer. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Angela. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, Meredith, there is so much going on in Minnesota. It was wonderful to hear about that. Thank you so much. I especially enjoyed hearing about the 4 Ps and how that has directed a lot of the work that you've done. For audience members, don't forget that you can enter questions for our speakers in the chat, and we're going to circle back to those during the Q&A portion. I saw that we had at least 1 question, which is awesome. If anybody else has any questions, please drop them in chat. We'll come back to those later. Next up, we're going to travel just a little east to talk with Jason Pontius, the Associate Chief Academic Officer of the Board of Regents with the state of Iowa. And Jason's going to talk with us a little bit about Iowa's data system.
All right. Yeah. Good afternoon from Iowa. Our SLDS started with a 2012 federal grant, and the Iowa Board of Regents was a founding member. Other members of the SLDS include K-12, community colleges, Iowa College Student Aid Commission, and Iowa Workforce Development. Private college enrollment and completion data is purchased from the National Student Clearinghouse, and we're adding early childhood data over the next 2 years. In many ways, we are the exact opposite of Minnesota, and Minnesota is likely proud of that fact. We use a federated model. We don't store data centrally. We store data only for projects. We have no dedicated state funding, and the SLDS is not legislatively mandated. Our number one lesson from building a federated SLDS is that trust takes time. Once we were up and running, we were able to answer a number of longstanding questions and respond quickly to some ad hoc questions. So this is the first slide's already up here. So for starters, we didn't really know what happened with our Iowa high school students after graduation. The post-secondary readiness reports were our first big deliverable, showing who went to post-secondary, how they performed, remedial needs, and when and if they graduated. We also found large gaps in college-going rates by race, ethnicity, free and reduced price lunch, and other demographics that varied widely by school district. Now, some of our plans going forward are to start splitting this. We show by high school, by school district, by area education agency, by state. We're also adding legislative district in, much like the state of Tennessee has been doing. Next slide, please. Another effort was made to address questions and frankly misinformation about community college transfer students. Within the universities, there was a narrative that transfers just didn't perform very well when they got to us. Among the community colleges, there were firmly held beliefs that the universities didn't honor credit hours being transferred. With our new community college transfer reports, we were able to poke holes in both of those and show that community college graduates do graduate at the same rate as direct from high school students, but they do take more time. And community college students earn bachelor's degrees with the same number of total credit hours as other students do when they're transferring in or starting from high school. As a bonus, among other things, we found that transferring with an associate's degree led to much better student outcomes. Next slide, please. In the realm of the ad hoc questions, many of you are aware of Nathan Grau's work predicting a significant decline in college-going students due to declines in the birth rate during the Great Recession. His predictions for Iowa were equally dire. But when I presented this work at our weekly SLDS meeting, and yes, all of our groups meet weekly, the K-12 folks said, we're not seeing that at all. And so we decided to go back and start doing some analysis of our own data. Next slide, please. We think Grau's methodology was sound, but his access to data was somewhat limited. So he was using the American Community Survey to estimate high school graduates and use national statistics on college going rates. And that likely works fine for larger states in the US as a whole, but not as well for some of the smaller states like Iowa. So with the SLDS, we had actual K-12 enrollment and actual college going rates. And so we used Grau's methodology, but we used our actual data and we found much less dire trends. So you can see Grau's predictions for Iowa in the blue. Red showed the actual enrollment of Iowans in college. And then the orange was our predicted rate, which actually fell in line very closely with WICHE and some of the work that they do. Next slide, please. Another ad hoc investigation looked at how many of our high school graduates who intended to go to college melted over the summer and did not end up enrolling. The investigation showed a particularly strong melt among students considering community college. So this has led to new grants to help improve community college transition counseling. Just one small little thing, one small report, and a nice way of trying to address it. Next slide, please. And speaking of assumptions, one assumption that we get a lot from Iowa lawmakers is this idea that students are fleeing Iowa to attend higher education in other states. And in many ways, this is understandable because most people know at least one family with a child going to college out of state. However, we're able to show that we're retaining 87% of our high school graduates. And this also allowed us to monitor where we are losing students out of state. And this was particularly important when South Dakota started providing in-state tuition to Iowa residents, and we were able to monitor that situation. Next slide, please. And finally, in one of our most ambitious efforts to date, our SLDS partners are working together to create a free e-transcript system for all Iowa high school students. We have pilot districts already enrolled, and we hope to have widespread adoption within 2 to 3 years. So by digitizing the transcript data, we open up a wealth of student performance data that was not otherwise easily attainable. Like, our colleges and universities receive these transcripts, but often they're in PDF format. And we just don't have the time and the resources to be able to transcribe all of these transcripts into data. But now this will be done for us. And it'll help us also to provide an automated admission system for all of our universities. So students will know within seconds of whether they've been automatically admitted to one of our 3 public universities. So we conservatively estimate that this is going to save school districts about $500,000 per year just by eliminating the need to create and mail transcripts. So that's it for my part of the presentation, and back to you, Angela.
Thank you, Jason, so much. I personally find it fascinating to hear about how different the Minnesota and Iowa data systems are, and yet am impressed that both data systems have been able to produce useful information for both states, and that it really both have proven to be really useful tools. So that is so helpful. Thank you so much for sharing. Next, we're going to shift to Aaron Lichten. Sorry, I got that wrong. I was worried about getting the last name wrong, and I got the first name wrong instead. Eric Lichtenberger, who's going to speak with us from Illinois. He is the Deputy Director of Information Management and Research, as well as the Chief Information Manager for the Illinois Board of Higher Education. Thank you so much, Eric. Over to you.
Yep, my name is Eric Lichtenberger, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So I guess I'm going to take you all through like kind of our journey within the state of Illinois, and I'll begin by describing the Illinois specific context. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So we do have a federated model within Illinois. I would say that the core component of what happens centrally within the state is what we refer to as the centralized demographic database administrator. And it's kind of a misnomer because in the end, all of the participating agencies are sending up the PII for each individual they come in contact with. And we do that for identity resolution purposes. So the CDDA creates a master client index ID that could be used across the 7 participating agencies within the Illinois longitudinal data system. And in Illinois, our governing board is comprised of leaders from those 7 agencies, as well as folks from the governor's office. There is a modest amount of staffing for the governing board that's provided by one of the public universities. But I would say that the core component of what we do in Illinois, specific to what goes on centrally, is just risk mitigation, because theoretically, once we share the PII, so that sensitive, identifiable information with that central entity, and we receive the master client index ID back, we could share our records freely among all of the participating agencies without having to worry about a data breach or something getting out where an individual is identifiable through some reporting we do. So I think risk mitigation is kind of a key factor. And even within Illinois, I think it's something that we don't focus on enough, because that's a huge benefit of what we do. So for example, I could share all of the recent college enrollment records of the participating institutions within the state with our partners on the K-12 side without having to share a name or a date of birth or a social security number. The system in and of itself was somewhat created through the Illinois Longitudinal Data System Act, which was passed in 2013. But that legislation was more specific to granting some of the agencies authority to capture different pieces of information from their constituent groups. So for example, the ILDS Act rapidly and significantly expanded IBHE's authority to be able to request and capture data from the degree granting entities within the state. And with it, there came a modest increase in our appropriation. We receive about $120,000 per year to manage our component of the Illinois Longitudinal Data System, which we call IHICE, or the Illinois Higher Education Information System. And some of our collections each year focus on enrollment. And within the enrollment file, we capture significant information on transfer students. We also capture information on financial aid. And we have those collections occur on a semester by semester basis. Also annually, we collect information on graduations, and we collect information on dual credit that occurs within the state, as well as developmental education, and then subsequent participation in gateway courses. So if an individual required enrollment within developmental ed English, we'll follow up with that individual and get their academic performance in English 101, for example. And that's all collected on an annual basis. And once again, we're able to relate all of these files together. So that the ILDS Act granted IBHE the authority to capture lots of data from the public universities, but we're also able to capture information from private colleges that are eligible for the state's need-based aid program. We call that the MAP grant within the state of Illinois. That covers most independent not-for-profit colleges and about 5 or 6 for-profit private colleges. And there was an amendment to the original ILDS Act, which granted us additional authority to capture information from private colleges that confer graduate or professional degrees. So we're able to collect information from about 115 different entities within the state. There are probably 20 degree granting colleges that fall outside of those 2 criteria. And we're currently working to make it so that we could just collect data from all private colleges within the state. I think we're currently required to operate 2 systems. So we still collect survey data from the schools that aren't required to give us student level data. And it becomes somewhat problematic. There's more of a lag time with it. And we can't do as much with the survey data that we collect from that small number of private colleges. So I think if you're thinking of passing legislation in another state, make sure that you give the state agencies authority to capture information from all degree granting entities. I think that would have made it easier within the state of Illinois. And there are some limitations with what we could do with the information that we collect from the private colleges. For example, we're not allowed to engage in any data sharing agreement that crosses state lines with the private colleges without getting approval from each and every private college to do so. However, with the public universities, we're able to engage in multi-state or national data sharing agreements without needing their permission. Okay, on to the next slide. So in developing a longitudinal data system, I think that the most advantageous way to get buy-in is to focus on areas of transition and overlap. And I think all of the previous speakers kind of hit on these points early on. So looking at high school to college transitions, looking at high school students who are earning college credit through AP or dual credit or dual enrollment or the international baccalaureate programs. So I think that the areas of overlap and the areas of transition are highly important in terms of policy. And I think they're highly important because a lot of members of the public are also interested in it. And as was mentioned earlier, developmental education has been a hot topic in the policy space. And thankfully, we started capturing detailed course level outcome information on developmental education about 3 years ago. And that really helped us drive the conversation. And there's kind of a concerted movement within the state of Illinois to move towards co-requisite modeling and away from traditional education. And I think having some of the outcomes information specific to that really helped in those discussions. But we're trying to avoid a one-size-fits-all policy within the state. The state of Illinois has traditionally done really well with its transfer students, particularly the students who start at community colleges and transfer to bachelor's granting institutions. I think that nationally, we're ranked #1 in terms of the likelihood of bachelor's degree completion for individuals who start at community colleges. And in Jason, the state of Iowa is #2, by the way. So the transfer system within the state of Illinois works really, really well. But based on the anecdotes that we hear from families and policymakers, you would think that it's completely broken. So we created a transfer dashboard using Tableau and the longitudinal data we collect to kind of show some of the benefits. And something else that we do above and beyond just putting data into a dashboard is that we try to create 1 or 2 page executive level summaries with our analysis stating what's going on. And sometimes it's more beneficial to provide additional context regarding what's going on nationally. And I think some of the previous speakers mentioned the need to include National Student Clearinghouse data within and being able to link that up with internal data systems. And that helps quite a bit. One of the things we worked on about 4 years ago was the connection between completion within the higher ed space and what was going on with our graduates in the Illinois workforce. And that was kind of an interesting project, and that ended up with kind of a two-pronged tool. So we do have a public-facing tool that displays the post-graduation earnings of individuals in different programs. I think we're able to drill down to the 4-digit zip code now. And in creating that project, what we wanted to do was to make sure that there was some value add to the institutions. So not only did we create a public-facing tool for that project, we also created an institutional researcher portal that all of the schools could use to analyze their own information. I think one of the things that I like to promote within the state is the fact that we're actually a fairly small agency. The Illinois Board of Higher Education has 30 staff members. I probably have 3 or 4 who work directly with me, so that there's no way we would be able to analyze information for all of these colleges individually. So our philosophy is to provide information to the institutions with the understanding that they better know their individual contexts and they could make better use of the information. So I think one thing in establishing a longitudinal data system is just making sure that you're providing some value add, not only to the state, but also to the institutions that are providing all of the information. And one good philosophy or approach for doing that is to make sure that you're able to provide the information or the schools with information that they wouldn't be able to access otherwise. And a good example was providing them with their workforce outcomes or providing them with information on their transfer students. So what the students who were originally enrolled at that institution do once they transfer elsewhere. And I think something else that we try to do as a state agency is to create new metrics that aren't available within any of the national reporting systems. For example, within IPEDS, they have retention, but retention isn't disaggregated by race or ethnicity or financial aid status. So we started creating a series of metrics that the schools could use for internal purposes, but metrics that we report publicly. And I think one of the things that we learned is that once we started making some of this information more publicly available, that the schools took the data collection processes a little bit more serious, and we experienced significantly better times in terms of our data collections and getting them complete, and the information magically became more complete and we had fewer errors. So sometimes just putting things out publicly improves data collection processes and data coverage. But one good approach for working with institutions is to ensure that they're properly socialized with the information and what you're trying to do. So it actually took a while with the earnings information because that was new and novel. So I think granting the institutions the ability to see their information before it goes public, and perhaps even providing them with more information and what's available publicly is a good approach. And on to the next slide. So I provided some links to some of the public-facing tools that we collect that focus on those areas of overlap and areas of transition. The Illinois College to Career tool is the tool that has the information where you could drill down to a specific program at a specific institution and see what's going on in terms of the Illinois specific workforce. We also provide information to our K-12 partners specific to remediation that occurs in the post-secondary space. And we've been collecting remediation information for several years now, but it became much more important from a policy context when we were able to provide remediation rates back to the high schools. So once again, focusing on areas of overlap and areas of transition really is a good way to demonstrate the value of a longitudinal data system. And once again, having better information out publicly about our transfer students. In doing so, we were able to counter this narrative that the transfer system within Illinois didn't work, even though we had definitive proof that we were among the best performing transfer systems within the nation. So sometimes, stories have more weight than data, but it's good to be able to use longitudinal data and to tell a story with it. I think one of the main areas of weakness for the longitudinal data system within Illinois is we don't have a good process set up for allowing access to outside researchers. I think most of the projects that are currently going on and most of the research that's occurring is still occurring through the agencies. So I think if we were to redo it, I think I would think of ways to facilitate using matched data among outside researchers first and foremost, instead of considering that as kind of an afterthought, because we are struggling with that process right now. And another limitation, and I think this is where Minnesota perhaps has an advantage over Illinois, is that they have more centralized research capacity that exists outside the agencies. So that could be something else that one would consider when developing a longitudinal data system. And another thing to consider is that at times it does take a significant amount of energy and effort on behalf of an agency to create data for research purposes. So if a state is building up a centralized entity with a lot of capacity, it might be good to consider building up the agency's internal research capacity as well, just so they could be more responsive to outside researchers and to that centralized entity. But that's really all I have to say. In terms of policy and how we've used the data, I think one of the more interesting things that we did was we used our student level data on the application side to look at where individuals who were accepted at different institutions ended up in concert with using National Student Clearinghouse data. In Illinois, we're traditionally known as a net exporter of our college graduates, and that the state of Iowa does a really good job of recruiting folks who graduate high school from Illinois. But what we were finding is that for the most part, a lot of our public universities, they were losing some students to out-of-state colleges, but their main competitor was students who were otherwise qualified. They were fully accepted into these given institutions, but they weren't enrolling anywhere. So I think we kind of changed the policy context from trying to address and tackle the out-migration issue to addressing and tackling the out-migration issue and figuring out why otherwise qualified individuals weren't enrolling anywhere. So having longitudinal data in place, we were able to change the policy perspective and broaden the scope of what we were trying to do. And I'll be quiet. I feel like I'm talking too much.
Not at all. That was all fascinating. Thank you so much, Eric. That was great insight into Illinois. And it's so interesting. Thank you to all of our panelists for speaking so far. This has been really illuminating, and it's been really fascinating to see how each of these three states have different systems, but has been able to utilize them to benefit the state and students. That is really what I think is the most interesting from all of these. What we are going to do now is my favorite part. We're going to shift over to our Q&A session. So there have definitely been some questions already dropped in, but if anybody has additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. First up, I have a question for Leanne. Leanne, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the vision for the Cradle-to-Career Data System in terms of phase one, sort of this first phase. What's the plan there?
Sure. So the phase one that we're identifying is going to occur within 5 to 7 years. So it's going to be a long up ramp, but that gives us a chance to get this off the ground, get it up and running, modified, and slowly adding value to the system. So at the end of the phase one, we will have actionable information on all the way from early education through K-12, through employment and social services, and be able to identify those equity gaps. And then we'd have some interagency data sets that can take a look at those milestones and see what's happening. I really was interested to hear what other states are working on. So those are giving me some ideas. We would provide resources and training and technical assistance for our policymakers, our practitioners, and the public, and then our college and career planning tools and monitoring and electronic transcripts would be fully implemented. So it's a wonderful list of things to do, and we are just hoping that it happens. Thank you.
That is so helpful. I think that it is going to be really exciting. One of the things that I am most excited about in phase one is actually the inclusion of private post-secondary schools. It's a little further on in the process, but I'm really excited about it. And I'm actually going to turn over to Wesley from Assemblymember Irwin's office. Thank you so much for being with us. And I was just going to pose the question to you. What is that value? We've heard Eric mention it in his presentation. What is that value of including all of the segments of higher ed, including the private colleges?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Wesley Whitaker, been working on this for Assemblywoman Irwin actually since the planning process kind of got started a couple years ago. So it's really rewarding to see the progress that's been made thanks to Leanne and all the others who've been engaging. So I'm a little biased myself, having gone to a private university. We think that they're very important, but they do serve so many students here in California. We know that we are always going to have not enough capacity in our public segments to serve everyone that wants to go to college here. I think, maybe it's our weather a little different than some of the Midwest states. We do attract a lot of folks who want to come here from other states. And I think there's a little bit of that kind of narrative that, oh, the private colleges are mostly out of state folks, but actually over 70% are California students. And especially if your UC or CSU is impacted, a lot of folks want to stay close to home, or geographic area matters to them. And so that's where a lot of these private institutions can really come into play a key role, especially helping us meet our workforce needs. We know we're not going to get there without everyone working together. And so, yeah, there was an intentional effort to try and make sure that we were including those folks as early as we could. And part of that also means giving them a seat at the table in the governance structure, because as non-state entities, we can't really compel them to do anything, but they can see the value of joining in with our system, and especially the way that we work with having Cal grants supporting some students who go to the private post-secondary institutions. It's really important to make sure that the state is making good investments there, and in some ways having Cal grants, that's a cheaper way to help educate students and also make sure that they are getting a really quality education. So that was definitely intentional on our part, and we have been working closely with AICCU folks, the Association of these Independent Schools, and then are also looking forward to the for-profits that are under the Department of Consumer Affairs, again, making sure those workforce needs are being met.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Wesley. As I said, that is an issue that is close to my heart, and something that I'm really excited about. So really looking forward to that. Meredith, I had a question that was posed for you. What are the benefits or maybe challenges of having two separate systems? And was it intentional to build them separately, or is that how that just sort of happened?
Yeah, I saw this question. So it was intentional. In Minnesota, it was driven by money. So at the time, Early Childhood, their startup was funded through a Race to the Top grant. And as you know, U.S. Department of Education grants can only go to the state education agency. So K-12 controlled that pot of money and kind of built that system. That was in the same year that SLEDS, the K-12 higher ed workforce system, actually moved to state funding. And it was actually funded through the higher education budget. So it came to the Office of Higher Education as the central administrator. That said, I noted that we're branded differently. Within the system, we have one administrative structure, one IT structure, one data governance structure, and one training and outreach structure. So those functions are centralized through the Office of Higher Education so that we're leveraging combined resources in a better manner. However, they have two different governing boards and two different sets of stakeholders. And while SLEDS is open to external researchers, the early childhood system is not. I would say they're about 5 years behind us in just developing those relationships and learning to trust one another so that they only do public reporting or legislatively mandated reporting right now. And so the advantages are, I say we can customize our messages. The disadvantage is sometimes it is twice as much work, but we're hoping to keep merging them together closer. Yeah.
That is super helpful. And I know that I had that question as you were talking, so I'm so glad that we got to dig into it a little bit. This is a question for everyone, all of our non-California panelists. Are there questions in your state that you haven't been able to answer that you wish that you could, is there data that you wish you could wave a magic wand and you suddenly had?
Sure, I'll take that. There are probably two areas that come to mind. One is our SLDS is built in the state ID system, so a student would have had to have touched the Iowa K-12 system to generate that ID in order to make the matches. So we're not using SSNs to kind of combine students. The other one is probably our private colleges. We get, as I mentioned, all of our private college data is coming through NSC, which is pretty limited in what we can get, but that's been the extent of what's available to us. And it'd be nice to be able to expand that reach.
Anyone else want to wave a magic wand?
I can chime in as well. And this is going to seem, it should be easy to fix, right? So Minnesota is one of those states where in our wage detail records, we do not collect occupation. And so all of our workforce reports will tell you about the employer the student works for, but not what they're actually doing. And I have to tell you, over the past 10 years, I've yet to convince our workforce agency to actually collect occupation. They feel that it would be too much of a burden on businesses to make that change. And so they've been resistant. I'll keep trying. I bring it up every year, multiple times a year to every single person I know of, but they've yet to move on that one point. The second point is financial aid data. So we too have financial aid data at our office. We have not added that to our SLDS system because of the gray legal area created by the U.S. Department of Ed in terms of FAFSA data use and kind of other program data use, which is problematic. And so we're still kind of wrestling with that. We can pull data back from our SLDS and do it in-house, but there's a lot more work to go into that, and we'd much prefer to do it the other way.
That is helpful. Yeah, I know that has come up in California as well, and trying to figure out what we can include and wanting to include that data because it helps us especially address equity and diversity issues and trying to make sure that we are walking the line to make sure that we are within the federal and state requirements for that. I know that we are almost at time. There are several really good questions. So here I want to do two in quick succession. Leanne and Wesley, this one is for you. Leanne and Wesley, where is the current budget efforts? Where are those in the process? And where is AB 99? And how can folks that are interested support those efforts?
Yeah, I'll start that one off. So we're all very anxiously awaiting the governor's May revision. He came out with his original budget proposal in January, and as a lot of folks in California know, the fiscal situation looks a lot better than it did. We were expecting a lot of cuts due to COVID, and thankfully, we actually have a lot of one-time money. So we're really happy that this has continued to be a governor's priority. We fully expect him to continue supporting this in his May revision. And then that's also kind of why we wanted to have a legislative vehicle, was to build that trust and buy-in and do some education of both staff and members about what this system could be and the value add that it could bring. So we do kind of intend to see a lot of the work done in the budget process, but then there will be chances to follow up later on if needed through legislation. But right now, I think the biggest thing is just to let your representatives know that you think this should be a priority, but also I think it's important to have that engagement at the local level, right, with your local school districts or your local colleges, and just asking, how are you using data to inform your best practices? I think we wouldn't be here without all of the work that folks like Leanne and yourself have already done, making sure that data is a priority and on the agenda.
Thanks, Wesley. I think the only other thing I'll add is that we are all looking forward to the May revise. It'll be coming out very soon, hopefully by May 14th. And then the final governor's budget should be signed around the end of June. So as of July 1st, we'll see what's going to happen.
It's a very exciting time. I know we are technically at time, but we did have one good question about how to create trust. So if each of our state panelists could answer in like one sentence, like what is your advice for how we should build trust? I think that would be a lovely note to end on.
I would say focusing on those areas of intersection, transition, and overlap, where the policies specific to what's going on might reflect or impact multiple partners. I think that's a good way to build trust, and keeping things small in planning to make some of the information public, but not doing it from a deficit perspective. I think as long as all stakeholders are fully committed to making things better for the state and for learners, I think it's fantastic. But so yeah, I guess building trust that way, keeping things limited, doing things in a pilot fashion, building from that, and then providing value add to the schools and other entities that provide the information.
That's helpful, Eric. Thank you. Jason or Meredith, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just say that kind of along the same lines, with baby steps, start with a relatively small project with limited scope, where you can get everyone to collaborate on. Particularly with our federated model, there really was not a lot of trust initially, but once we got that first project done, people realized that, okay, they're not going to steal our data, they're not going to misinterpret our data or send it off to somebody else. And then the momentum really starts to build off of that.
I would add to that, just saying, communicate regularly, often, and about everything. Because as long as you're transparent and open with every decision you make, even if it seems minor, people learn and will start to respect the process that you've enabled. We operate kind of on I would say we operate kind of a middle ground between 100% consensus and no one has veto authority. And so finding kind of how that works out is always an ongoing process, but communication. Yeah.
Well, that is incredibly helpful. I want to first thank all of our speakers and panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this wonderful insight. I know that I have found it incredibly helpful and enlightening, and this is something that I already spent a lot of time thinking about. So I am so glad, always an opportunity to learn something. Thank you also to all of our audience members that have joined us today. A few housekeeping tips I wanted to say is when you finish, you're going to get a post-survey or a post-webinar survey. If you're able to fill that out, that would be incredibly helpful. I also wanted to flag that TICAS has a website with resources. We dropped some links into chat during the conversation today, but there will be additional resources, all the presentations, and additional links, as well as a fact sheet that is available on our website, and the link just got dropped into chat. So just wanted to flag that for everyone. But thank you again so much all for joining us. I apologize for going a few minutes over, but I hope that you thought it was as worth it as I did. And with that, thank you so much and happy Friday.